what GST has done to the federal structure is it has restricted the ability of the state to levy its own taxes, or do a much more precise, targeted taxation and have your own local level, because you get into the GST council and whatever is left to you is, as of now, fuel, excise, land revenue, and things like that, and motor vehicles and so on. How much does that affect your budget making, particularly given that you've also decided to ease a little bit of your tax revenue on something that could have been a milking cow, which is fuel, right? That is one part of it. Second, is there a tendency to push, not necessarily with the state governments or the center, to push a whole lot of things onto the off-balance sheet side, where you create a special corporation and that sort of incurs losses, or you create a SPV which doesn't get into the regular budget but gets refinanced once in 3, 4, 5 years, and therefore goes under the radar. Since you are from the corporate world, you understand the off-balance sheet contingent assets and liabilities much better.
Yeah, there's probably about half an hour worth of response for that. So let me try and keep it short and take the easy one first. Off-balance sheet can be good or bad, right? My first job at Lehman on the commercial paper desk, 1 week after I went in, I got what they call in the US a blanket subpoena. Said, hand over your computer, your hard drive, your papers, your everything, because we were a commercial paper dealer for Enron, and they had just discovered the whole rawhide and all this, so-called innovation of off-balance sheet entities that collapsed. So off-balance sheet entities can be good or bad. You can also have good off-balance sheet entities. Like if you want to do infrastructure funding, it's very easy to get public-private partnerships and set up port companies or road companies where there's a guaranteed tolling kind of revenue. In fact, the history of India is not that good, and Tamil Nadu has been horrendous. We claimed the lady, when former chief minister had a vision, good vision with ADB and other people's support, but when it came to execution, it's quite a mess, and I've inherited a mess that I'm cleaning up in terms of off-balance sheet entities like the infrastructure fund and all that. But it can be done well. I mean, it can be done very well indeed if it's done properly. So I won't get into that. I'd say, off-balance sheet can be for good or bad reasons. If it's for bad reasons, there's a limit. Nobody's that dumb in the world of finance or in the world of, developmental finance. So if you try to push like 5, 8, 10% of your GDP into like off-balance sheet vehicles every year, it's not a perpetual machine. At some point, you're going to hit bottom and have serious consequences. On the other hand, off-balance sheet can be done really well if done for the right assets with the right partners at the right rates. So I won't go too much into that. As far as GST is concerned, of course, GST was a fundamental loss. My friend Praveen Chakravarti and I wrote an article in the Mint newspaper, I think in April of 2017, before GST came into effect. And we said there's a downside to one nation, one tax. And we talked about the specific example of through MGR, then Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, who decided one day he was going to expand the noon meal scheme to all children, irrespective of any means testing, and say whoever comes to a government school should get free food. The estimated cost was so high that there was no way to finance it. So he said, no problem. Tamil Nadu will raise its sales tax from 7% to 8%, finance the meal scheme, and get done. I think most people would say it was a tremendous success. It resulted in fundamental improvements in nutrition, in development, in learning, in gross enrollment ratios, in reduction in dropout rates, in reduction in child marriage, in reduction in child labor. It was a phenomenal success. So that we saw this coming, right? So in April of 2017, we said the problem with GST is we lose that flexibility. We are a relatively well-to-do state. We may decide we want to raise some tax for something, for some purpose, and we're not going to be able to. Be that as it may, GST is GST. Now I got bigger problems than the fact of loss of independence, right? The implementation has been so afterthought-based. So many hundreds of changes. Profound fundamental issues like what should be for approval, what should be for ratification, what should be for information are still being debated 4.5 years later. The whole notion of compensation was designed badly. It was designed only to cope with idiosyncratic risk. When systemic risk came and the system failed, the union could have been much more gallant about it, much more civilized and caring about it, but ended up trying to be very churlish then ended up doing the right thing, kind of anyway, by monetizing part of the compensation dues. So, to me as a professional, the implementation of GST has left a lot more to be desired than the basic problems with the concept of GST. And I make this example in a couple of different places. I say that, Tamil Nadu is not just a high production state, but also a high consumption state, because we have a very low Gini coefficient compared to most people. And therefore, our per capita consumption is quite high. In places like Gujarat and Maharashtra, their per capita GDP is higher. But because the Gini coefficient is much higher, the per capita consumption is not really nearly as much as ours. It's not as driven by consumption. So realistically, we expected that we should find our IGST in and IGST out should not change that much. If you're a high production state, of course, you're going to lose revenue. If you're a high consumption state, you're going to gain revenue under GST as opposed to your local sales tax. But a place like Tamil Nadu, we should not see much differences. And I would be the first guy to say that we are not that great at compliance in Tamil Nadu. I'll come back to why in a second, or a structural problem with that also in a second. But the data is very clear to us that compliance in other states is much worse than compliance in our state. So we have this like couple thousand crore gap between IGST in and out, which we ought not to have. Now you come to what's the problem with compliance. The problem with compliance is that part of it is done by union government officers in the indirect tax department. Part of it is done by the state. There's an alleged split. It's just, it's not clear who should take care of what. It's not. And the government has tried to make up for bad design and bad execution and bad monitoring and bad inspection by making the laws draconian and threatening to send you to jail and all that, which is not, enough of a stick to change the work. I'll go one step further. In the nature of this one nation, one tax, there are already cracks starting to appear. I attended the 43rd GST Council as a member on behalf of Tamil Nadu. One of the items that came for discussion was, in a further move to increase ease of doing business, should we allow those with less than 5 crores turnover to not just file once a quarter, but pay monthly? Should we move them all the way to file once a quarter and only pay quarterly as opposed to pay monthly? And there was a range of reactions. And I would say, excuse me, the mid-level reaction was kind of Karnataka, which said, hey, this is going to seriously affect our liquidity management and our current asset, current liability kind of adjustment. We pay salaries and other things monthly, but we'll only get these things once every 3 months, as opposed to, on the other extreme, were many of the kind of northeastern and Goa type states, which said we simply cannot afford it because we have to pay our bills monthly, and the small businesses below 5 crores are such a great proportion of our total GST that if they were to pay only once in 3 months, then we just couldn't do it. And there was people like me on the other side that said, in the grand scheme, we don't get enough of our money from the below 5 crores. We're a big state. We have other, kind of ways to think about this. We'll manage. But the two things I pointed out in the meeting itself, I said, A, you have just said one nation, one tax. In this debate, you have come to the point where some people say I'm small, therefore I should have a different model. Some people say I'm big, therefore I should have a different model. Some people say I'm more industrialized, so I should have a different model. So your own, discussion here has shown you why one nation, one tax, one standardized policy is a fallacy. Then I said one more thing. I said, it's appalling to me that all these debates happen in the absence of data. If we had GSTN already calculate and tell us ahead of time before we come to the meeting, here are all the states for whom 50+% of their total GST revenue comes from below 5 crore entities. Here are all those for which is 25 to 50. Here are all those below 25. Something we could have known what to start the discussion with. That data is not forthcoming. And I go one step further. I said, if really the only problem is liquidity management, no problem. You just say, of course, you go to ease of doing business. You file once every 3 months. You pay once every 3 months. But it's not all the same month, meaning you don't all follow the calendar year or the fiscal year. Some people pay January, April, July, etc. Some people pay February, May, August, etc. So you stagger the 3 monthly payments so that you actually get the liquidity in the right way. So there are 100 ways to solve a problem technically. But if you don't have data and you insist that you must have a standard approach, then the system itself is going to fail. It is not sustainable. It's just, one man's willpower cannot make something come true. we are a country of 1.4 billion people. There must be some underlying science, some logic, some data, some thinking, some compromise, some adjustment. It is not possible to make something come true because I say so. We're not in Star Trek. Scotty, make it so, and something happens. And it doesn't happen like that. So I think that's the part that frustrates me the most.